Every time the Navy unveils a new aircraft carrier, the conversation almost always drifts in the same direction. People talk about its size, its speed. They talk about how many jets can fit on the deck at once. Those details are impressive and they photograph well, but they are not the reason aircraft carriers decide wars. Aircraft carriers do not dominate because they arrive fast. They dominate because they refuse to slow down. The U.S. Navy's newest carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, carries a weapon that rarely shows up in headlines or recruiting videos. It does not sit on the flight deck. It does not glow, fire, or launch anything dramatic into the sky. You could watch the ship operate for an entire day and miss it completely. But once you notice it, everything about modern naval warfare starts to look different. Now, first off, you should know that the Ford-class carrier did not come cheap. The ship itself is commonly put around the $13 billion mark. And when you fold in research, development, and integration, the total bill climbs several $billion higher. But what gets lost in that argument is what the Navy was actually paying for. The ship was not built to be bigger than its predecessors. It was built to behave differently than them. And the fact of the matter is that no matter how powerful aircraft carriers have always looked, their effectiveness was always limited by something far less dramatic than enemy missiles or bad weather. They were limited by time. Every jet that launches has to come back. Every jet that lands has to be refueled, rearmed, inspected, repositioned, and then launched again. Crews have to move ordnance. Elevators have to cycle. Deck space has to be cleared and reused over hours and days. Those steps decide how much air power a carrier actually delivers. That rhythm is known as sortie generation, and it sets the ceiling on how much pressure a carrier can apply. A carrier that carries dozens of aircraft but can only launch them slowly becomes predictable. A carrier that keeps launching aircraft hour after hour becomes oppressive. The Navy did not ask how fast the ship could go. Nuclear power already solved that problem. They did not ask how many aircraft could physically fit on the deck. That question had already been answered decades ago. They asked something much colder and more uncomfortable. How fast can this ship reload itself? How quickly can it recover aircraft, turn them around, and put them back into the fight without pause? And how long can it keep doing that before people and machines start to fail? Those questions were the driving force behind almost every major design choice on the Ford class, and they explain why this ship looks familiar at a distance, but behaves very differently up close. In modern warfare, tempo decides who adapts and who reacts. The Ford class was designed to apply pressure without interruption. It can run past 30 knots, which is no small thing for a ship of that size. Nuclear propulsion lets it keep operating without routine fuel stops. But speed alone doesn't explain why this carrier is different. In a real conflict, carriers do not chase enemies across the ocean like racing yachts. They position themselves, establish operating areas, and begin cycling aircraft. That's where the older carriers began to show their limits. Previous classes were never designed for the kind of sustained high-tempo operations that modern conflicts demand. The Ford class was built to change that equation. From the earliest design stages, the Navy treated sortie generation as a central requirement, not as an afterthought. That meant rethinking how aircraft move, how weapons move, how people move, and how electricity is distributed across the ship. The Ford class generates far more electrical power than its predecessors to support systems that reduce friction everywhere else. More power means more automation. More automation means fewer delays. And fewer delays means more aircraft in the air over time. This is where the ship's price tag starts to make sense. The Ford class is often compared to other nations' carriers, and the gap is enormous. Most of the world's carriers are smaller, conventionally powered, and built around far lower operational tempos. Some navies can launch a handful of aircraft at a time. Others rely on ski jump ramps that limit aircraft weight and payload. Even the most capable non-US carriers cannot sustain the kind of flight operations the Ford class is designed to handle. They were never meant to. Their strategic goals are different. Their budgets are smaller. Their doctrine accepts limits the US Navy does not. That comparison matters because the Ford class is not just a ship. It is a statement about how the United States expects future wars to unfold. In a conflict across the Pacific, distance is a weapon. Bases are far apart. Replenishment windows are narrow. Aircraft have long transit times. Every delay compounds. A carrier that can regenerate aircraft faster than its opponent can respond gains an advantage that is hard to counter without escalating dramatically. that advantage does not announce itself with explosions. It shows up when aircraft keep arriving after the enemy expects the deck to be empty, when defenses remain under constant pressure instead of short, predictable bursts, when pilots land, refuel, reload, and launch again while the opponent is still trying to repair damage from the last wave. This is why the Ford's most important capability is easy to overlook, and it only becomes obvious after hours of sustained operations. The Navy knows this, which is why they have been careful about how they talk about it publicly. Promising specific sorting numbers invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites criticism when reality fails to match projections perfectly. The Ford program has already faced its share of technical hurdles, from new launch systems to weapons elevators that took longer than expected to mature. Those issues matter, and they will matter even more in wartime. No ship is flawless. So, it goes without saying that no system works exactly as advertised under combat conditions. But even critics can agree on one thing. The Ford class represents a deliberate attempt to change how carriers fight, not just how they look. The ship was built to make sustained air power routine instead of exceptional. And that shift has consequences that ripple far beyond the deck. It affects how many carriers the Navy needs to maintain presence in multiple regions. It affects how long a carrier can remain on station without relief and how adversaries calculate risk and escalation. It even affects how allies view the balance of power at sea. All of that stems from a capability that does not fire a shot. The USS Gerald R. Ford carries 90 aircraft, but its real strength is not how many jets it can carry. It is how quickly it can turn them into pressure over and over again. And that's only one piece of the picture. Every carrier, no matter how advanced, lives or dies by how efficiently it moves people, fuel, weapons, and aircraft through a very crowded space. The flight deck may look enormous, but in practice, it is one of the most congested workplaces on the planet. Every movement has to be choreographed because mistakes cost time. Every bottleneck compounds on older carriers. Those bottlenecks were accepted as the price of doing business. Steam catapults dictated launch timing. Weapons elevators moved at fixed speeds. Deck crews worked around island placement that reflected decades-old design assumptions. When everything ran perfectly, the system worked. When it did not, the pace slowed. And once the pace slowed, it was hard to recover. The Ford class was designed by people who were no longer willing to accept that. Instead of asking how to squeeze more effort out of crews, the Navy asked how to remove friction from the system itself. The result is a carrier that behaves less like a traditional warship and more like an industrial process optimized for throughput. That optimization starts with the most visible change, even if most people misunderstand it. The Ford class replaced steam catapults with the Electromagnetic Aircraft Launch System, or EMAS. On paper, IS sounds like a technological flex, and that is how it is often discussed. Electromagnetic launch, linear motors, precise control curves. Recovering jets is where many carriers quietly lose time. Landing cycles stack up. Aircraft wait overhead. Deck crews scramble to clear space. Small delays cascade into larger ones. The Ford class tackles this problem by rethinking deck flow. The ship's island, the tower that houses command spaces and radar systems, was moved further aft. That change sounds minor, but it opens up valuable deck space and alters how aircraft move between landing areas, parking spots, and catapults. Below the deck, the changes become even more consequential. Weapons movement has always been one of the slowest parts of carrier operations. Bombs and missiles are heavy, sensitive, and dangerous to move. The Ford class introduced advanced weapons elevators designed to move ordnance faster and more efficiently. These elevators were meant to be one of the ship's biggest contributors to improved operational tempo. Every part of the system has to move together. That is why the Ford class was designed as a single machine rather than a collection of upgrades. Automation plays a quiet but critical role here. The Ford class carries fewer sailors than previous carriers. Even though it is larger and more complex, that reduction was not achieved by asking people to work harder. It was achieved by designing systems that require fewer hands to operate and maintain. All of these changes point in the same direction. Faster launches, faster recoveries, faster weapons handling, less friction between steps. There is no single moment where the ship reveals its power. Instead, the advantage accumulates quietly hour by hour. This is also where the price tag begins to look different. $13 billion sounds outrageous when you imagine a ship sitting at sea doing nothing. It sounds less outrageous when you consider what the Navy expects that ship to do over decades of service. Most navies around the world do not operate carriers like this. Many operate them as symbols of national power or regional influence. Their carriers launch fewer aircraft less frequently and for shorter durations. That is not a flaw. It reflects different strategic goals. The U.S. Navy expects its carriers to serve as mobile air bases capable of sustained combat operations far from home. That expectation drives everything about their design. The Ford-class pushes that expectation further than any carrier before it. But all of this engineering effort serves one purpose: to protect something fragile, the pace of operations. Because once a carrier slows down, it becomes predictable. Once it becomes predictable, it becomes manageable. And once it becomes manageable, its deterrent value erodus. The Ford-class exists to delay that moment for as long as possible. It does not guarantee dominance. No ship can. It does not eliminate risk. Nothing does. What it does is buy time. And in modern naval warfare, time is the one resource everyone is trying to steal from everyone else. To understand why this carrier changes everything, you have to stop looking at it as a ship and start looking at it as a signal. Aircraft carriers do not exist in isolation. Every carrier sails inside a web of assumptions made by allies, adversaries, economists, and planners who spend their careers asking uncomfortable questions about power. How long can it stay? How much pressure can it apply? How quickly can it recover if something goes wrong? The Ford class is meant to sustain pressure thousands of miles away from home against an opponent who is actively trying to make operations expensive, risky, and exhausting. This is why comparisons between carriers can be misleading. Looking at raw numbers like displacements or aircraft capacity misses the point. A carrier that can launch 40 aircraft in a short window and then slow down is fundamentally different from one that can keep launching aircraft all day long. The difference shows up not in the first hour of a conflict, but in the third day, the fifth day, and the second week. The Pacific theater is defined by distance. Bases are separated by hundreds or even thousands of miles. Replenishment takes time. Aircraft spend long periods in transit. Every sortie becomes more expensive in fuel maintenance and crew fatigue. In that environment, pauses are dangerous. If a carrier has to slow down to reset, the opponent gains space. That space can be used to disperse assets, repair damage, reposition defenses, or simply wait for political pressure to build. A carrier that maintains tempo denies that space. In planning scenarios involving a high-end conflict, analysts often talk about windows. Windows to strike, windows to resupply, windows to exploit temporary advantages. These windows are measured in hours, not days. A carrier that can regenerate aircraft faster effectively shortens those windows for the other side. That changes how risk is calculated for an adversary. The question becomes whether they can absorb sustained pressure without time to regroup. That is far more uncomfortable a problem than dealing with short bursts of intense activity followed by lows. This is why the Ford class has drawn so much attention from planners focused on China. China's naval strategy emphasizes layered defenses, long-range missiles, and the ability to complicate carrier operations far from shore. The goal is not necessarily to sink carriers outright, but to make operating them costly enough that their presence becomes politically and militarily difficult to sustain. In that context, tempo matters as much as survivability. A carrier that keeps launching aircraft forces defenses to stay active. Active defenses reveal themselves. They eat resources and exhaust crews. Over time, the burden shifts. Sustained pressure wears down even sophisticated systems, not because they are poorly designed, but because they are operated by humans with limits. The Ford class's ability to generate sustained air power changes how long it can remain a credible threat. It also changes how many carriers the Navy needs to achieve a given effect. This point is often overlooked in debates about cost. The Ford class is expensive in a way that makes it impossible to ignore, but the Navy has never argued that the price tag should be judged in isolation. The real claim is that a single high-tempo carrier can offset the workload of multiple older ships over time. That argument depends heavily on automation, reduced crew demands, and long-term operating efficiency. None of those benefits arrive quickly. They only emerge if the ship performs reliably for decades. That long horizon is why early technical problems drew so much attention and why foreign navies are paying close attention to whether the gamble pays off. Countries that operate or plan to operate carriers look at the Ford class as a glimpse of where carrier design may go next. A carrier that can maintain high operational tempo reduces the need for escalation to achieve effects. It applies pressure quietly. Its signals resolve without dramatic gestures. It forces adversaries to respond continuously rather than episodically. This is why the Ford class is terrifying in a way that raw firepower is not. It does not rely on a single decisive moment. It relies on accumulation. But this advantage is not free. Sustained operations use a lot of resources. Aircraft are faster. Maintenance cycles tighten. Crews operate closer to their limits. Supply chains are stressed. The Navy is well aware of these trade-offs, and they have not pretended otherwise either. The Ford class does not remove friction from war, but it shifts where that friction is felt. Instead of slowing the ship, the burden moves outward to logistics, to adversary defenses, to political decision-making. This is why the Ford class has to be understood as part of a system, not a standalone solution. It travels with escorts equipped to protect it. It relies on supply, ships, and depends on intelligence networks and satellites to guide its aircraft. Any opponent planning to counter a Ford-class carrier has to plan for endurance, not just impact. They have to assume that the carrier will not politely pause after the first wave. They have to prepare for sustained operations that test systems and people over time. That preparation is expensive. It forces investments in redundancy, resilience, and depth. It forces hard choices about where to concentrate resources. It compresses timelines for decision-making. The USS Gerald R. Ford was built to stay in motion. The secret weapon is sortie generation rate. For the Ford class, the Navy's target is 160 sorties per day during normal operations with the ability to surge to 270 sorties in a 24-hour period during sustained flight operations. Those numbers are not marketing taglines. They are design goals that shape the ship from the keel up. The faster you complete that cycle, the more pressure you apply. This is why sortie generation is often described as reload speed. In a Pacific conflict, this becomes decisive. It changes how air defenses behave. Defenses designed to defeat short bursts of activity struggle under continuous pressure. Sensors stay active longer. Missiles are expended faster. Crews get tired. Mistakes creep in. A carrier that does more with less time reduces the strain on the rest of the fleet. Yes, the Ford class is expensive. Yes, its development was rocky. Yes, the early systems had problems that critics were right to question. But the Navy was not paying $13 billion for a prettier Nimitz-class carrier. They were paying to change how carriers behave under stress. It also has limits. Sword degeneration does not make the carrier invulnerable. Enemy missiles still exist. The weather still interferes, and even the best crews get tired. For the rest of the world's navies, the lesson is not that they should copy the Ford class outright. Most can't, and many shouldn't even try. Nuclear propulsion, massive electrical capacity, and global logistics networks are uniquely American advantages. The most powerful weapon on a modern aircraft carrier is not what it fires. It is how often it can fire and how long it can keep doing it when everyone expects it to stop. That is the secret weapon, and it is already shaping how the next war will be planned, whether anyone wants to admit it or not. So let me ask you this. If you were building the next generation of carriers, would you spend the money on flash or on endurance? Would you chase spectacle, or would you design for the long grind? Drop your thoughts below. I read everyone. If you want to support the channel and help us keep telling these real naval stories, you can join the fleet by clicking the join button on our channel page. It helps us to dig into more stories like this without watering them down. Thanks for watching. We'll have more like this coming soon. I'll see you in the next one.